You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 7th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Israel observes the first anniversary of its worst day. Not for the first time, a huge African war struggles for attention. And what does it take to get America's youth to vote at all? Never mind for a particular candidate. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Daniela Peled and Sir Mark Lowcock will discuss the day's big stories, and as Freeze London gets underway, we will hear from its artistic director. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Daniela Peled, Managing Editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and by Sir Mark Lowcock, Fellow of the Centre for Global Development and former Head of Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations. Welcome both to the show.
Hello.
Hello.
Mark, you have recently returned from the always fairly extraordinary experience of the full-blown Indian wedding in India.
It was absolutely sensational. My first one ever in Mysore, which is now my very favourite city in the whole of India. Leafy, fantastic food. And I didn't know this, but India's second most popular tourist attraction, the Mysore Palace, which at 8 o'clock every Sunday evening is lit up in the best light show I have ever seen anywhere.
I mean, was this one of the proper Indian weddings, i.e. the wedding goes on longer than some marriages?
It was, Andrew. 5 days. My eldest niece. There were horses, there were panoplines, there was every conceivable sort of Indian food. It was absolutely sensational.
Elephants?
There was no living elephant, although we did visit some later.
Okay. Well, that's not too bad. Just before we catch up with what weird museums Daniela has been visiting recently, which is always the thing when Daniela's on, we are rigorous about allowing guests on the Daily to absolutely plug the bejeebers out of upcoming books. You have one upcoming.
I do. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Department for International Development. It was out last Thursday, in fact. Nicely reviewed by the likes of Gordon Brown and Bill Gates. A story of...
now you're just name-dropping.
Oh, I am. You betcha I am. A story of progress and destruction.
OK, well, we will be having you on the Daily at some future juncture to talk about that in further detail. Daniela, I have already cunningly foreshadowed that you have again been visiting weird museums.
I have, as predictable, and I tend to do this when I'm travelling. I have been in the UK for a little while, so I've been a visitor in my own home city of London. And this week I've been to the Sir John Soanes Museum, not too far from here in Holborn, which is a wonderful collection, the personal collection of one of the foremost architects of the 18th century. And when he died, and I like this, and I'm planning maybe something similar myself, he left his whole collection of antiquities and antiques to the nation and said that his house had to be left exactly as it was when he died.
You're planning to leave your flat exactly as it is?
With its priceless collection of antiques. Surely.
Are the antiques priceless, though? I mean, I'm not knocking them.
History will judge, Andrew. History will judge.
History will indeed. We will start today's show proper with today's date. And it is probably the case that October 7th has already become a date like September 11th, where there is only a need to fill in the year if you're not talking about the obvious one. On this day a year ago, hundreds of Hamas fighters escaped the confines of the Gaza Strip and conducted a killing spree across southern Israel that left around 1,200 people dead and a nation traumatized. 1 year on, Israel's response has killed, according to authorities in Gaza, more than 42,000 Palestinians and in more recent weeks more than 2,000 Lebanese. Some of both of those numbers will have been militants associated with Hamas or Hezbollah. Many will not. Daniela, first of all, if you reflect over the last 12 months, has anything about it surprised you, or have things unfolded more or less as you might have expected they would?
What has surprised me is that really the worst predictions have come unfailingly have come to be. For the last year, there's been these warnings, this mustn't expand into a regional war, and this looks like it has, and we can talk a bit more about that, I hope. But and the other things that haven't been surprising is how, you describe it as 9/11, and I think that's a very good choice of words, because it was Israel's 9/11. It is Israel's 9/11, not just in terms of body count. It was the worst, most murderous day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, but also an absolute change in viewpoint. So the contract in Israel between the state and civilians is that the army will protect you. We will protect you. We are strong. We are military. We are militaristic. Everyone serves in the army. All Israeli citizens are valuable. We have reached a year, and there are many hostages still in Gaza. And the trauma, the fact that this contract was broken because the army took hours and hours and hours to rescue citizens in on October 7th. That has traumatized the nation. And the other thing, which is not surprising but extremely disheartening, is also the level of dehumanization of the Palestinian victims of this conflict, and the detachment, and the fact how the Israeli media has not shown really what has been happening in Gaza, and has not given an understanding. The consensus is people are protesting against the hostages not being released, but the war, people support the war because the consensus is that it's very sad that civilians are dying, but it's Hamas's fault. And it's that kind of groupthink, and it's that kind of almost docility in the face of the national narrative that I think is perhaps not surprising, but I would have thought that Israel, which often describes itself as a vibrant democracy with a pluralistic media, I would have thought that there would be more pluralism and more diversity in that.
Mark, a question that over the last 12 months I've not yet heard a satisfactory answer to, and I won't therefore blame you if you're as stumped as I am, is it any clearer than it was a year ago if we try to look at this from the perspective of the people who ordered this attack, what good they thought it was going to do them? Because the response that Daniela is outlining there, and it has been about the worst case scenario, nonetheless, nobody can have been surprised by it. You would think not least Hamas.
I don't think it is at all clear, Andrew, no. I think there's two things that are predictable about what we're about to see, and three things I think are unpredictable. The first predictable thing is, Danielle has just alluded to this, it's going to be absolutely ghastly and horrific and terrible beyond imagination for the population of Gaza for as far into the future as we can see. They will be starving, and they won't have medical services, and they won't have education. There'll be no rebuilding. The second thing is, that's predictable, I think we're going to have another Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, as we did from 82 to 2000, another incursion in 2006. But it's the unpredictable that worry me even more, actually. I think the first of those is there going to be further escalation, which Daniela has worried about just now? Will Israel attack Iran's nuclear facilities? Would that lead to the kind of escalation which would shut the Straits of Hormuz, cutting out 20% of the world's liquid natural gas production, probably doing much more to the gas and oil price than Putin was able to do in 2022? Secondly, what will the effect of all this be on Prime Minister Netanyahu's domestic political position? Because he's been very unpopular for much of the last year. The incursion is actually quite popular. Will this give him a way to hold on to power for longer than might otherwise be the case? And then the third thing, which we'll actually never know the answer to, but could be the most momentous of all, is what is the impact of all this going to be on the outcome of the US presidential election?
Mm-hmm. Which is probably weirdly unknowable, as is a lot of the others. Daniela, in the current issue of Monocle magazine, and indeed a version of it appeared in this morning's Monocle Minute email newsletter, I did posit a kind of alternative scenario. Basically, the idea would have been that maybe Benjamin Netanyahu listens when US President Joe Biden visits Tel Aviv and suggests that Israel don't make the same mistakes, as Biden put it, that the United States did after 9/11. Would it, if Netanyahu had decided to do that, listen to that, if he'd accepted this council of restraint and maybe just said, look, we will fortify this border, we will one day find the people who were responsible for this, and we will settle the account with those individuals, and then just not launch the onslaught that Israel has, If he decided that was what he wanted to do, would that have been politically possible for him, or is he too far politically in hock to the far right of his own coalition?
He is very, very dependent on them. But what was extreme far right a year or 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago is Israel is moving towards that position becoming more mainstream. So the very far right in his cabinet are religious Jewish settlers. But the parameters of what is acceptable has shifted. Now, I imagine that this was the prediction, and there have been incursions before. There have been flare-ups in Gaza every few years. They have what one Israeli official rather horribly called mowing the grass, where they would do some targeted assassinations, and there would be et cetera, et cetera. I don't think anyone expected that this would be the result a year later. But Netanyahu is very much a strategist, in a way that Israelis tend to respond. They don't tend to have long-term aims, and he's good at that as well. But Iran has always been top of his list. He banged on about how it was the greatest threat to world security long before it was kind of fashionable and other people joined that. I remember being briefed 10, 15 years ago by Israeli officials who were explaining to me that no, there's an axis of good, and that's the moderate sunny states, and then there's the bad guys.
This is the line Netanyahu was pushing with his maps he was waving around at the UN.
Exactly. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, Saudi Arabia is a moderate sunny state. Okay, fine. But that's the reality that we're in now. And I think that this is the huge danger now. I mean, we can talk about this, the human danger and the human impact of civilians on the ground, but a wider regional conflict, it's inevitable that the US will have to become part of that. And the impact on the elections, I think, will be catastrophic, because Biden has been roundly humiliated by Netanyahu again and again and again. And Donald Trump, say what you like about the guy, but he does stuff, right? He does stuff. He says he's going to sort Ukraine out in 48 hours. And he did push through the Abraham Accords during his presidency, which, despite all the bloodshed, is still standing firm. So a guy that can do stuff and not get America involved in this huge regional conflagration is going to look quite attractive.
Mark, just finally on this one before we move on to other things. On today of all days, it does sound somewhat fatuous to be scrabbling around for an optimistic assessment, but there have been some people, and it is possibly the definition of wishful thinking, who have said, look, awful though all this is, if we manage to avoid the wider war, if we wind this tape forward a few months to a situation in which Hamas more or less ceases to exist as a factor, in which Hezbollah more or less ceases to exist as a factor, in which the Iranian regime is clearly extremely weakened and possibly very, very confused. And as Daniela points out, if not friendship, then I guess alliance of convenience between Israel and those Sunni Arab states has more or less held together through this. Is there any kind of opportunity there for the kind of diplomatic settlement which might preclude this kind of thing happening again?
Well, it's a huge if.
It's a very huge if.
But potentially, and that, I guess, is what everyone needs to work towards. One bit of that forward path that would need to be addressed in a serious way is what is going to happen in Gaza. Israel has devotedly avoided saying what it thinks the arrangement should be for Gaza into the future. And the place is now being run, to the extent it's by anyone, by a bunch of thugs and criminals who are trying to control the food distribution. And that's because there is no local civilian authority. And really it is on Israel, I think, to work out, well, what is your game plan for the future of Gaza, having ruled out most of the options that have been put on the table?
Well, let's move along somewhat, and it has always been the case that wars in Africa, even really big ones, struggle for global attention relative to even smallish dust-ups occurring in the Middle East or Europe. At a moment when actually really big wars are occurring in the Middle East and Europe, any African conflict is doomed to indifference, even when it is one as big, and it is, as the one still besetting Sudan. Since fighting began between Sudan's military and a rebel faction thereof last April, at least 20,000 30,000 people have been killed. This is likely an underestimate, and around 10 million displaced. Daniela, this is a question I'm sure comes up at the Institute for War and Peace reporting fairly regularly. Why, as a general rule, do African wars get a lot of attention than other people's? Is it just logistics? Is it the fact that it is, frankly, easier to report from Jerusalem or Beirut than it presently is from, for example, Khartoum?
I think it's a complicated question. There isn't one answer. I do think racism is part of it as well. I mean, they have this perception. I wouldn't describe either Israeli Jews or generally people of the Middle East as white people, but there's a narrative that is easier to follow. And there's this kind of post-colonialist narrative which is much more digestible. I mean, on Saturday, after I went to the Sir John Soanes Museum, I happened to chance upon the weekly pro-Palestinian march in central London. And although there are many, many reasons for people to want to protest about the war in Gaza, it's impossible to ignore the fact that there was a lot of sort of how can I put it? Pink-haired vegans, heavily tattooed people, and people who are on a bit of a jolly, and well, it's great that people want to be involved in political protest, but the thing is fashion is really, really fickle. So no one particularly seemed to care about the Syrian war, for instance, and Sudan has been raging for nearly 18 months. And I'm sure if I stopped at most of those protesters, they wouldn't have known a thing about it. But also it doesn't fit that simple narrative. If I was to simplify it, I would say it was two bad guys fighting a bad war with huge numbers of people and who are suffering in an extreme way with no clear way out. And even the international support, the sort of backers, whether it's Iran or UAE, even that is less clear in Sudan than it is in so many other conflicts around the world.
I mean, Mark, I think it's not inaccurate to sum Sudan's war up as exactly that, two bad men fighting a bad war for a bad cause and for bad reasons. But is that part of the reason that nobody else, apart from those countries involved for their own nefarious ends, nobody wants to involve themselves as, I guess, the interlocutor who is trying to stop this? And even if somebody wanted to do that, could they do it?
Well, there are plenty of people who do want to calm it down. Most of the region now, some of whom are responsible for starting it, actually, but most of them now want to calm it down, and the US and others would like to calm it down. I think there's three reasons why it's getting less attention. It's hard to deal with. The first is this is unlikely to have the kind of global consequences that a Middle Eastern war with the shutting of the...
But it could have serious regional consequences which could have global consequences.
Well, in Sudan, it's not on the order of Ukraine, Russia.
Indeed not.
Nor is it on the order of shutting the Straits of Hormuz. That's the first reason. The second is if you're only the second most important war people are worrying about all the time, you get very little bandwidth. And what gets the attention of policymakers is broadcast and print media who lead to public interest in countries where those things are set out and people can see, which forces policymakers to respond. And then the other thing which really complicates the Sudan war is it really is regional but hidden and covered. So all the neighbours are involved in one way or another, but most of them are lying or dissembling about it. And there's little glimpses of other people poking their finger in as well. The Russians, as everybody knows, through the Wagner Group have been there. And curiously, the Ukrainians as well. Even most bizarrely, some of them sometimes the Russians and Ukrainians apparently on the same side, albeit fighting little local battles. So it is very, very complicated, and it's hard to see without other things being calmed down somewhat how enough pressure can be brought to bear on the two bad guys. And I've met these guys and they are two bad guys. It's hard to see how enough pressure can be brought on them to force them into some kind of deal. At the moment, as Burhan said at the UN 10 days ago, he thinks the answer is war, war, war.
Just to follow that up quickly on this, Mark, you do, as you said, have the advantage of having met the protagonists. How often, though, does something like this come down to whether one of or both of the leaders of the factions being willing to listen makes a difference?
Well, ultimately, that is important, but equally, they've all got constituencies and large numbers of people across the country egging them on who they rely on. So leadership is both about knowing where you can take your followers because they're willing to come with you, but also where you can direct them to. And these two guys are weighing up those they're doing those calculations all the time. Where would I like to get to? But also, where do the people I'm reliant on, where will they let me get to?
Well, we will now consider with due trepidation the US presidential election 4 weeks from tomorrow. One of the many, many, many oddities of the 2024 US presidential election is that the most obvious conduit of the youth vote come election day will be a 60-year-old lawyer from Oakland. Vice President Kamala Harris, for it is she, has been attempting to engage with the youth by appearing on Call Her Daddy, one of Earth's most popular podcasts, especially among the young and or women, though we here at the Monocle Daily would contend that being the 56th most popular daily news show in Kyrgyzstan is not nothing. A big hello to our listeners in Bishkek, Osh and Razakov. Here is some of what the Vice President had to say.
There are a whole lot of women out here who, one, are not aspiring to be humble, who have a lot of love in their life, family in their life, and children in their life. And I think it's really important for women to lift each other up. We have our family by blood, and then we have our family by love.
Donald Trump's VP pick, J.D. Vance, called women who don't have kids childless cat ladies. What message do you think this sends to women who cannot conceive or just don't want kids?
I just think it's mean and mean-spirited. And I think that most Americans want leaders who understand that the measure of their strength is not based on who you beat down. The real measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you lift up.
Why should we trust you?
I'll say this. Look, you can look at my career to know what I care about.
Vice President Kamala Harris speaking on Call Her Daddy. Daniela, does that, as the representative as you are at this table of the youth vote...
youth and female.
Youth and female vote. Speaking on behalf as you are, the entirety of... is this good outreach, do you think?
I think it makes a lot of sense. Following on the heels of Taylor Swift's endorsement, and which led to a huge rise in donations. I mean, I think underestimating it means we underestimate the young female vote. And Kamala can be and has been criticised in many ways. And then this interview was just it was a very soft interview, and she hasn't done much hard-hitting stuff, which is disappointing. However, if you're looking at a constituency which you want to mobilise, so women and young women, considering Donald Trump's views on reproductive freedoms, that's a group that has a lot of investment, and also a group that may not have otherwise voted or been particularly engaged. So it's getting so close. It makes sense to me to mobilise those constituencies. It can't hurt. It doesn't really help her image as like a hard-hitting, serious politician, but she's not doing very well when it comes to that anyway. So, yeah.
On which subject, Mark, I don't know whether you've had this conversation a lot with American counterparts, and I don't think this is a uniquely American problem, but in countries which are not, unlike my own country, sensible enough to make the vote compulsory, young people do tend not to turn up. In the 2020 US presidential election, it was only 50% of 18 to 29-year-olds even bothered to cast a vote, and that, possibly a reflection on fears of Donald Trump, was up from 39% in 2016. That's like nearly 2/3 of eligible voters under 30 who decide they simply cannot be bothered.
Well, that's what Kamala Harris is calculating. And one of the things I like about coming on the Daily Show, Andrew, is stuff I'd never heard of before. I'm not just talking about your Bishkek fan base, by the way, but I'd never heard of this podcast. Of course, I'm not the target audience. Actually, I suspect one of the things the Harris
they've never heard of this podcast.
I suspect one of the things the Harris team are hoping is that Donald Trump will take up Alexandra Cooper's invitation to go on the podcast himself, which they think would be a way to get a massive increase in their support from women in the 18 to 24 age group. But it is a problem that there are so few young people voting in general in elections. It's a problem in the UK as well, because it means that politicians are not attentive enough to the issues that matter to them, above all in this country, housing.
On the subject of Donald Trump, Daniela, we should check in on his campaign. He appeared at the weekend with Elon Musk jumping strangely up and down behind him. Musk has now gone fully and obviously unapologetically MAGA. But does it strike you, because this is now incredibly the third time we have seen Donald Trump run for the presidency of the United States, does it strike you that he is noticeably weirder than he was on the previous two occasions?
No, not me. I thought he was weird from get-go. I mean, after the third time round, what's noticeable, I think he has occasional moments where he's capable of sticking to a script where he's trying to be reasonable and not really insulting, but it doesn't last at all. I think what I'm interested in is the impact that his wife Melania's memoir is going to have, because she comes out as a very articulate and outspoken and fervent supporter of a woman's right to choose.
Except, of course, that she didn't write it, indeed probably hasn't read it.
Yeah, that's not the point, is it? But it's an interesting development, because again, I think this area is one that can. I mean, we have this sort of the people are divided in America, maybe largely along conservative religious lines, but this is something that really impacts on women, and it cuts across those sorts of divisions. So I'm wondering if that's. I wonder what the impact of that is, because it does show a certain amount of diversity within the Trump household.
It would be quite something if he was thwarted at the final hurdle by an intervention by Mrs. Trump, who just didn't fancy going through all that again. We are a month out. Just before we move on to something else, I will ask you both briefly. We won't hold you to this, Mark. Do you want to pick this one? Who's going to win?
In 2016, I put £100 on Trump at enormous odds. And I took the family on holiday as a result. This is too close for me. The one thing I am interested in is this year, unlike 2020, people say the ground game might matter. This is all air war stuff we've been talking about today. And if that's true, we'll maybe find out on the 6th of November. That will be interesting, because then it will be a little bit like the election we had here on the 4th of July, where there was the Tory ground campaign was non-existent, and the Lib Dems in particular did fantastically well because they had a really terrific local support base, including in my constituency.
Daniela, do you want to pick the winner?
I think if the October surprise turns out to be war with Iran, then it's, as I said, it's going to be Trump. But I am going to say Harris, just because I really want that to be the case.
Well, to now the latest efforts by those liberal pinko weirdos in Sweden to make child rearing generally easier. Honestly, what if it catches on? The country which pioneered paid parental leave has now kicked it up a generation, making it possible for new parents to transfer paid parental leave days to their parents, or indeed anybody who is not a legal guardian, though presumably only after asking them. Otherwise, who knows, any one of us could now be responsible for 6-month-old triplets in Helsingborg. Daniela, are you enthused by this? Not about the prospect of discovering that you are in fact legally responsible for 6-month-old triplets in Helsingborg, but by the idea?
No, I'm very enthused by the idea. To me, it makes a lot of sense. I raised my son on my own, and I recruited the help of many willing or unwilling volunteers. But what needs to change, really, though, is not just having the legal framework or making this acceptable. It's actually people doing it. Lots of workplaces, especially government or official ones, offer shared parental leave. The number of men who take this is vanishingly small. I doubt most men take the 2 weeks paternity leave that they're eligible for as well. I think we have a societal change to deal with here, partly because in this country we don't really like children, and we see them as a useful stick to beat women with. So women should somehow are supposed to stay at home whether they want to or not. So that's another hurdle to get over. So you need affordable childcare to make this work. It also needs to be extended to the wider society, because I'm not sure that, especially as people have children later and later in life, I'm not sure that these grandparents are going to be in any sort of fit state to do some serious childcare, because it does actually require you to engage in with the child. And as far as I know, I don't think uptake has been huge in Sweden, but it's certainly a move in the right direction.
It has not been uptakingly hugely uptaken, uptook. You know what I'm trying to say. It has, you're right, it's only been going a few months, this variation on the programme, and it has not been hugely uptook yet. But Sweden, Mark, have been way out in front on this stuff for a long time. I was looking this up earlier. Their current birth rate is a bit higher than most EU countries, although not interestingly higher than in the Balkans or in France. The French are really getting a move on here. But is this basically the answer to all those governments which worry ostentatiously about declining birth rates, i.e. figure out how to spend the money to make this actually easier for people to have families?
As always, I am totally there for this new Swedish innovation, and I'm absolutely gagging for it myself. There's only two slight caveats. I don't actually have a job which I could seek grandparental leave from, and nor do I have any actual grandchildren.
Mark, you're an author, which I can tell you for a fact is an absolute licence to print money.
Well, I wish that were true. It hasn't happened to me with either of my two previous books. I'm clearly doing something wrong. I suspect the Swedes, as often, are a generation ahead of where this is really going to be useful. When our children were little, my parents stopped working because they wanted to spend a lot of time with their grandchildren, including my nephews and nieces. And it's a verboten topic in our house to raise this topic because for fear of putting pressure on the young people who are not quite ready yet. But I do think that for them, when, because they'll have to work into their 70s, and maybe if they breed at the time, as Daniela was saying, that other people tend to, that's when grandchildren might start to arrive. And so this could be a very real thing at that stage. And so the Swedes, as ever, are a generation ahead of the rest of us.
So Mark Lowcock and Daniela Peled, thanks both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the art world will flock to a rainy London this week for Frieze, a major affair in the year's cultural calendar. Ahead of the event, artistic director Ava Longrat joined Monocle's Sophie Monaghan-Coombs here at Midori House to share some insights into what visitors might expect. This year, the famous white tents have undergone something of a redesign for the fair's 21st birthday, and Eva began by describing how things might look and feel a little different.
So, design has always been a really strong point of Frieze London. And when you think about the fair and its location in Regent's Park, and you think about us being able to showcase our galleries within this beautiful, light, bright tent, it really sort of sets us apart from many of the other fairs that take place within convention centres. Mm-hmm. And so we've always worked with an extraordinary design setup, but there's always room also to improve things. And one of the things that I really wanted to work on this year is to actually really emphasize this position within the park and, create something as simple as opening up the sides of the tent so you're able to see the beautiful Regent's Park when you're inside Frieze London is really something that we were not able to do before. So there's been some really simple design improvements like this, which I think are going to make a huge difference. And then, once you walk inside the tent, then all the gallery placement is going to be different. We're bringing the focus section, which is the section dedicated to young galleries, 12 years and under, much closer to the entrance. And I think this is somewhat an architectural statement about the importance of that section and the fact that this is where we're talking about the future of the art world, the artists of tomorrow, the people who are going to make the news and are going to be here chatting with you in the next, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. So for us, it was really important that the architecture inside the tent also reflects this sort of wider statement around what we stand for. And then, there'll be many more areas for people to sit down and connect. I think the experience of Frieze London is one that takes hours. Most people come into the tent in the morning and then they leave at night. Sometimes you lose sense of what time it is. You might get hungry. There's a lot to see. So I think also really wanting to make that visitor experience more pleasant. So, there are more squares, there's more seating, we have a new restaurant sessions coming. So really thinking about that experience as a sort of day-long experience and how we can make this as pleasant as possible for our visitors.
Well, I can't wait to experience it. And you mentioned there the kind of architectural statement about bringing younger galleries to the forefront. And I wanted to ask you about the curated sections as well, specifically artist to artist, which you've done before, but I wonder if you could explain that and why it has been such a success before and you're bringing it back, and maybe there's some other curated sections you want to highlight as well.
So Artist to Artist is a section that we started last year to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the fair. And this was really about, again, stating the obvious, but really thinking about how important artists have been to the DNA of the fair, but also before the fair. We come from a magazine and it's always been about writing about artists, presenting artists' work. So this is really where we come from. And last year, this section was really successful, and, there were actually a number of really huge success stories. But so the principle is to ask an established artist to select another artist for a solo presentation at the fair. And so all the artists who select are artists who, as part of their practice year-round, support other artists. So they either curate or they teach, or they might be building studios, they might be building institutions like Yinka Shonibari in Lagos. So these are artists who have a huge network of other artists that they support, a huge knowledge of what other artists are doing. And so for me, it was really interesting to tap into those networks and tap into those knowledge to really bring new voices to the fair. And so this year we're working with Glenn Ligon, Zineb Sedira, Hervin Anderson, Yinka Shonibari, Rashid Johnson, in amongst other artists who each have selected another artist for a solo presentation at the fair. And so there are incredible discoveries in this section. Yinka Shonibari has selected a wonderful artist called Nengi Umunku, who is based in Lagos, and she trained as a horticulturist, so she's really interested in plants and nature, but she also paints. She makes those really incredible large-scale paintings, and she paints on traditional Yoruba cloth that she finds in the markets of Lagos. So this is one of the presentations that I'm really excited about. And last year, one of the things that happened at this section is that it was really a career-changing opportunity for the artists who participated. There were cases of major institutions like Tate acquiring works by those artists. And so this really can change, the trajectory of an artist's life and an artist's career. So it's a section that I'm really proud of. And again, many discoveries, many new voices there that I'm excited for everybody to see.
Yeah, definitely. And we're coming off the back of Frieze Seoul and also the Armory Show, which was its first edition under the kind of full ownership of Frieze, but it's obviously been running for a few decades. And I wonder, kind of within that context and Frieze as a whole, how you're thinking of London in relation to those other fairs and what you're particularly excited London is going to bring to all of the collectors and the kind of art enthusiasts who will come, and also in comparison to those other fairs, how it might be similar and carry on a similar story or a similar vibe, but also how it might be different as well.
I think as we, expand and as there are new cities that are become part of the Frieze family, it becomes more and more evident that really each fair feeds on the sort of creative spirit of each city. For London, that spirit has always been a sort of pioneering spirit, ideas around being experimental, ideas around maybe sometimes being irreverent, and then ideas, I think, also around welcoming new voices and being really open to that sense of newness, new artists, younger artists, new ideas. I think this is what really makes London special. Seoul is incredible. It's a city that's really has a long history of art institutions and galleries that predates Frieze. But also, since we've been in Seoul, we've seen also the city really expanding with new galleries coming, new institutions opening. So that's really been an exciting scene to be able for us to witness. And then, of course, then you have, New York, which is very much a grande dame of the art world, where all the goods and the greats are coming together with incredible institutions. So, each city really has its different sort of vibe. And I think you can really feel that in the curation of the fairs, which really tries to tease out what it is that makes those cities special so that, visitors who come really have an experience and a feel for what's happening creatively in each of those capitals.
It was Ava Longret, Artistic Director of London Frieze, speaking to Monocle's Sophie Monaghan-Coombs. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Daniela Peled and Sir Mark Lowcock. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by George Ruskin. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Do you want the tactility of print and the speed of digital? Well, sign up for a Monocle subscription today and enjoy 10 issues plus 4 annual specials, as well as access to the Monocle Digital Editions. The Monocle Digital Editions offers improved access to the magazine on the go and at the touch of a button. It also includes our extensive archive of global reporting and a growing roster of travel guides and tips too. Head to monocle.com/subscribe to sign up now.